security and trauma. I've talked to disaster responders who experienced being threatened by people as they responded to disaster with drone technology. Because people just don't have a good way of knowing what the drone is up to. It's that inscrutability factor. They don't know what your motive is or why you're there, and in the absence of a universal UTM system, it's really hard to identify who's flying a drone and for what purpose. And that's a huge problem for aid workers, because aid workers' access to disaster environments and their safety is totally dependent on trust. They have to be perceived as impartial and neutral actors to stay safe. And if they think that drones are going to make them unsafe if they use them, if they think that people will conflate their drones, the military drones, if they think people will be afraid of them, they're not going to want to use them. The potential of drone technology will be lost if people don't trust drones. And here's a story about drones and trust and unexpected consequences. In the aftermath of the deadly 2015 Nepal earthquake, a lot of volunteer drone pilots came to the scene. It was kind of a coming out party for drone technology. It was all over the news and media. I mean, I wrote a bunch of stories about it. And these people had really great intentions. They were coming to Nepal to make maps, to participate in search and rescue, to help people. But the problem was a lot of these people, these drone pilots, not all, but many, lacked humanitarian experience. They lacked experience in Nepal. They didn't have a good sense of how incredibly complicated the humanitarian aid system is and what happens during these giant disasters when so many organizations are trying to coordinate airspace especially. And as a result, unfortunately, the drone response was kind of a mess. People were not coordinating. They weren't coordinating with the United Nations. They weren't coordinating adequately with the Nepalese government. And it caused a lot of consternation and stress because people just didn't know who's flying that drone and why, what are they up to? And eventually, the Nepalese government got so fed up with this that they decided to impose really harsh restrictions on drone technology not long after the disaster response to the earthquake began in Nepal. And their argument for this was that they were concerned that the drone imagery was going to reveal things they didn't want revealed, like sensitive military sites or cultural sites, and the drone pilots didn't have a way to get that information about sensitive sites from the Nepalese government, or they weren't coordinating, so they decided to crack down on the entire technology. And the problem with that is that that had a bigger impact on Nepalese people than the people who were coming in to help. Because that meant if you're a Nepalese entrepreneur or a Nepalese drone pilot, and they absolutely exist, I've met them, you have a big problem now because it's a lot harder for you to use the technology. The drone pilots were there to help, they wanted to volunteer, but they accidentally made things harder for Nepalese people in some respects. And that's an example of the unintended consequences that we need to be thinking about and attempting to avoid. This problem with the general distrust of drones and how it makes it harder to use them in humanitarian contexts and for those purposes. So when you hear this, you might think something like, oh, well, okay, so we just have to tell people that they actually don't have anything to worry about. We just have to tell people that drone data is safe. We're not going to spy on them in their bathroom. We're not going to look at their kids. We're not going to do any of that crap. But the problem with that is that, one, it's not particularly convincing, as I think you probably agree. And two, are we sure about that? Are we absolutely 100% sure that our drone data is safe, that we completely understand all the possible risks and issues and ways it can be used to hurt people? The ways that your average person, your average idiot even, or your average nasty sociopath might use our drone data. I don't think we can say that with confidence right now. I don't think we're there yet. I do not think we adequately understand the risks presented by drone data to people, and that's a problem. And if we don't understand how those risks might change for people affected by disaster or war or genocide, we don't have a good product for humanitarian aid workers. Or we don't have a good product for anybody, but especially for humanitarian aid workers. So here's some frameworks or ways to think about this privacy data security problem, or the frameworks I work with. So one, we talk a lot about PII, personally identifiable information. This can be a legal definition, but in the context I'm talking about, it refers to any kind of information pertaining to a human being, a single individual. So you, me, whoever, Stuff like our face, our license plate, maybe even our daily travel patterns, that kind of stuff. But we're also talking increasingly in this privacy data security world about DII, demographically identifiable information. And that's information about you that might pertain to general categories of person, like your gender, your racial identity, maybe your ethnic identity, your religion, that kind of stuff. And that can also be picked up, at least theoretically. Actually, it can be picked up by a drone in certain circumstances. Now, if we think about these two categories of information, it helps us frame our thinking better about risk and what we can do to mitigate it. But we also need to do a better job of understanding, okay, what kinds of PII and DII can we collect with a drone? I mean, just now I had to guess, but where's the research that shows what kind of stuff are you most likely to collect so we can prevent ourselves from collecting it by accident? We just haven't done a good job of constructing what us humanitarian researchers call a theory of harm, a theory about how PII and DII from drone data can be used to hurt people. And we need that because the entire point of the humanitarian project is alleviating human suffering, neutrally and without bias. To quote philosopher and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer, humanitarianism consists in never sacrificing a human being to a purpose, which I really like in the context of technology. We don't understand drone data risk and how it might change disaster dynamics. We risk hurting people. And that's ethically terrible from a humanitarian viewpoint. Obviously, it's bad, but it's also bad for the drone industry. Because if people think that drones are too risky or have risks that aren't adequately understood or researched, they're not going to want to use them. They're not going to want to keep them legal to use in their countries or in their airspace. So how do we ensure that we're delivering on the promise that we all want to make, that we are behaving ethically and responsibly, that we're keeping people safe, that we understand the risks that drone data represent? How do we do that? Are there tools or methods or methodologies? Well, there kind of aren't right now, or not as many as there could be. I get asked this a lot in my working life, my workplace. How do we do this? Like, how can I ensure that I've done everything I can to protect people's privacy? And I don't have a lot of good solutions or answers or tools, and that needs to change. We need to fix that soon. So here's one framework, picture. Lost the picture, but here's one way to think about this. It's an exercise that's often called red teaming. The idea is that to protect people effectively, you have to think like the nastiest people on planet Earth. Think like the most horrible person you can imagine. In other words, think about what would Thanos do from the Avengers movies, a supervillain. It's unpleasant, perhaps, but if you think like an evil person, then you can kind of anticipate what might happen if some horrible person gets their hands on your data. So the scenario I brought up at the beginning of this talk is one example of this kind of thinking. As you can anticipate these risks before you actually release your data or your technology into the wild, if you can imagine these things, you can get out in front of them. You can help protect people and do a better job of that. And that's really important. That's something that we need to be doing on a much more widespread basis. And not just in drone technology, God knows, but across the entire tech sector. I think everybody should be doing this much more often. Another important step is more research. And I'm obviously biased, but I think we need to do a better job of quantifying, clearly describing the actual risks that drones represent to people. Research we can point to when people come at us in the drone industry with what we think are overblown or silly claims about how dangerous drones are. Here's one example of good research along these lines. In 2017, researchers in the UK found that human beings couldn't reliably identify other human beings from Parrot AR drone photos shot from a maximum altitude of just 45 feet. That's really useful information, and I refer to it regularly. We should be doing more experiments just like this, in different contexts with different sensors and different types of drone, different altitudes, so we can put numbers to our efforts to reduce the risk of collecting personal, sensitive information. If we can point to this research, we can hopefully make people feel better about drone technology and prove that we've done the work of keeping people safe when we use our tech. We can also create clear technical training guides, pointers, and best practices, things we can teach other people and keep our people in our organizations, make them adhere to, or build that into our software, into our hardware as we move forward. Next, we also should think about developing technical solutions to this problem. So maybe we need to develop privacy analysis software. A lot of police departments are now using body cameras to document what they do during their day. As a result, a bunch of companies have sprung up that are offering redaction services for that body cam footage. So the idea is that, it helps an analyst, because you do have a human in the loop here, it helps an analyst go through that body cam footage and pull out stuff that might be sensitive or problematic. It speeds up that analysis process. Because I've gone through drone imagery and video searching for PII, and it's boring, it sucks. We could be doing this much more effectively. Another technical solution might be, there are ways we can reduce the drone's field of view in the air to ensure it's only looking at what we want it to look at. If we crop out areas of the image that really aren't related to what we want, so we can lower the risk of inadvertently capturing something we're not even interested in, but that could be a problem, and that we don't even notice at the time. So technical solutions like that would be incredibly helpful. And finally, we also need to talk to people in the sense that if we're doing humanitarian aid work or disaster response work, we have to understand the context really well, because data risks are pretty much always highly contextual. They're highly linked to the community, people's circumstances, all the stuff that we're not going to know if we just showed up 24 hours ago. If we talk to people and listen to them, they're going to be more inclined to trust us. They're going to be more inclined to trust that we're going to treat their data and themselves with respect. And also it'll help us learn things about risk. For example, if we talk to people, we might find out that some people have been evacuated after a hurricane are really worried that if a drone image of their village goes up on the internet publicly, then people will discover they've got a really nice plot of cropland and they'll move to steal it from them before they manage to get back. Because land grabbing actually happens all the time in a lot of countries. It's a huge issue. And that's just one example of contextual data that we're not going to know about if we aren't asking people or speaking with people, if we're not listening. And also, we need to work to uncover the stories that drone data tell, or rather, we need to follow the data cradle-to-grave cycle. In other words, what happens to data after we capture it and hand it off to the end user, who's not a drone pilot, nothing to do with drones? What decisions do they make with that? Do they keep it safe? Who gets to look at it? Do we know? We really don't have a good sense of how this works in many cases. I've tried to do this cradle-to-grave mapping of data in the disaster response sector, and it's really difficult. So if we had more of this information, this sense of what happens to data after we release it into the wild, we'd have a better sense of how to keep people safe and how to understand the risk adequately. And ultimately, this all comes down to trust. It comes down to the fact that we need to do a better job of showing people they can trust us with research, with good research, with, again, contextual conversations, with good technical tools, showing people they can trust us instead of telling them they can trust us. As an example, think of the ongoing debate in the USA right now over local control over drone technology versus FAA preemption. I think a lot of that, in my experience reporting on this, is rooted in people's fear and distrust of drones. They don't trust the government will protect them from drones. There's no federal law. So they want to impose local restrictions because they don't trust us, they don't trust drone pilots to use their data responsibly. And if we don't move to do that ourselves, we don't take that responsibility to some extent on ourselves in ways that are realistic, people will make rules for us in ways that we don't like and really don't appreciate. It'll hurt the drone industry. If we want to build the drone industry, we have to build public trust. Then we have to research the risk in ways that are easy to communicate and that make sense to people. And if we think, this is a really important way for us to build trust and also to counter people come at us with ridiculous ideas about how dangerous drones are. And the good news is, I think we can do this. I think we are going to be able to pull this off because new technologies always go through a period of social adjustment of fear. People were terrified of cars in the early days of motorized vehicles. People were afraid of airplanes. There's always going to be this fear and adjustment period. And we have a chance to change the narrative now. And we can do that with better research, proving that we are trustworthy. We prove we're responsible stewards of data in disaster response humanitarian aid. we can prove that we are going to do the same thing for all other industries. Humanitarian aid is just kind of the point of the spear where these issues become most evident, but they apply everywhere. And if we do this, we can build the drone industry in ways that are ethical and that help everybody, that really advance the drone industry in ways we can be proud of. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Which includes all of our previously recorded session content, every webinar we've had with a thought leader, and even past episodes of this podcast. On top of that, it includes an index of every person who's ever spoken at Interdrone and every company that's relevant to the drone space. The best part is all of that information interlinks so you can find the tools and resources you need to advance your drone program. Memberships start for free on Launchpad. All you have to do is go to launchpad.aero and sign up today.